We need to finish up a little bit of theology from the prologue before we dive into chapter 4. So as you can see on your notes, Roman numeral 2, theology from the prologue, which we didn't get to last week, is innocence. So the first question is suffering related to sin?
Yes.
Yes, that's correct. How is it related?
Because there's none righteous, no, not one. For all sin comes short of the glory of God.
Okay.
I didn't get what he said.
Well, he said, because there's none righteous, yes, suffering is related to sin.
But that's general.
Right. That is,
That's
but that does bring us to the first blank. You can see there's a blank underneath that yes, which is all suffering is indirectly related to the fall and to humanity's universal sinfulness. So Bill is bringing up the universal sinfulness of man. And so because of the fall and because we're all sinners, all suffering is indirectly related. So that's the blank, is indirectly related. But some suffering is actually a direct result. That's the next blank, direct result of your sin. For example, if you're mean to your friend or your spouse, then a direct result is going to be a worse relationship, a worse friendship, perhaps a broken relationship. So that's just a direct result. Can anyone else think of another direct result? The way in which suffering could be a direct result of sin?
Disobedience to God's word.
Okay, yes. And so so a specific example would be if you choose to do drugs.
Got drunk.
Yeah, or you get drunk, you might...
Misbehaved.
Adultery.
Yeah, so there's going to be all kinds of... Yeah, you commit adultery, that's going to be all kinds of repercussions in your life. So that suffering that might come from the brain damage from the drugs or the fallout from the affair is a direct result of your sin. And some suffering is divine punishment.
amen.
That's the next one.
Also to learn. If you don't suffer, you don't know who to turn to. And until you suffer enough, then suddenly you realize that there is no one out there who can help you except the Lord.
Okay, yes.
It's a consequence.
So, but not a consequence in the sense of...
Of your sin. In regard to your sin.
Right.
Because of your sin.
Well, yeah, but there's two different things going on. One is, if you play with matches, you might burn your fingers. Just, if my kid's, he's not allowed to get the matches on his own, but if he does, and he burns his finger, I'm like, well, that's just a natural result. But on an unrelated note, now I'm going to spank you because you disobeyed me. So you see, one is a result and one is a punishment. And then that's not a very popular truth in our culture. People don't like the idea of a God who punishes. But the Bible is very clear that some suffering is a divine punishment for sin. For example, Herod was eaten by worms, right, as a direct result of a punishment from God because he
acted like God.
Well, people said, oh, it's the voice of a God. And he was like, yes. So he accepted that kind of praise. When Paul was called a God, he was like, no. I'm not a God. But Herod didn't do that. And so Herod was immediately and directly punished. Also, of course, hell is an example of suffering that's a divine punishment, the ultimate divine punishment. And even for Christians, what did Paul say about people who take communion in an unworthy manner? Like, that's the reason some of you are sick and some of you have died. Because you're disrespecting the Lord's table. So some suffering is a result of it.
So was that 4?
Well, so we got indirectly related, all suffering is indirectly related. Some is a direct result, some is divine punishment. 4 is, but those facts, the fact that we all sin and all that, does not rob the book of Job of its point. The point that it's emphasizing. So Job's goodness, highlights Job's goodness, is meant to emphasize the fact that there is such a thing as innocent suffering. Sometimes there is undeserved suffering. And Christians sometimes try to avoid that. For example, some Christians will use this whole, the fall, it's a broken world, we're all sinners, as a blanket answer to solve the problem of suffering. Here's an example of it. So an atheist says, this is in the box, how could there be an all-good and all-powerful God who would allow innocent suffering? Sometimes a Christian might answer this way. There is no innocent suffering because there is no one innocent. And then they'll quote Romans 3:23. You see how that could be used as a blanket answer. Anytime someone brings up the problem of suffering, I'm just going to use that. And that might sound good, but it's a very simplistic answer, and it breaks down very quickly in the real world. An example of that is if a child is raped, is there any way in which that child is responsible for that? No.
None whatsoever.
Obviously. So let's think of a 6-year-old girl who's raped. She's obviously, her suffering is obviously a result of sin, someone else's sin. But that is actually what makes her an innocent victim. And obviously she's not perfectly sinless. She's all people are sinners, but it's very obvious that there's no sin she could have committed that would make that an appropriate punishment. No matter how self-centered that little girl is, the rape is not an appropriate punishment for her sins. Yes.
What about a woman who is very risque in her dress, very enticing?
Well, that's
What happens when she gets raped? What is that?
Well, my point
I know.
Is that there is innocent suffering.
That's exactly right.
So,
She's asking for it.
well, yeah, that's a separate issue. I'm not going to address that one right now. I'm sorry.
I mean, we're talking
Well,
about,
that could be direct and it could be innocent, I guess.
we're talking about a 6-year-old here.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's-
Yeah, that's a separate issue. So, but the point is that if a Christian answers that, there is no innocent suffering because no one's innocent. But there is innocent suffering. That's actually wrong. Because yes, this is a fallen world, and yes, we all sin, and yes, all sinners will eventually be punished, and they will eventually suffer. But also, there is innocent suffering. Now, if that same little girl plays with matches and burns her fingers, that's not innocent suffering.
She went into an area she didn't belong.
But the suffering that we're talking about, the rape, that's innocent suffering. There's no way in which that's her fault.
How do you answer the atheist then? Or would you recommend, how would you answer the atheist?
Well, that's what part of what this book is. That's part of what this book is doing.
Yeah.
But this point needs to be made because otherwise Job won't make any sense.
Okay.
So no, it's okay. But it needs to be a discussion. Because, one answer is, well, how do you answer it? If you're an atheist, your answer is, it doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Nobody's talking about the poor suffering of the antelope when the lion eats it. That's just nature. But with human beings, we can see that there's an innocence and there's something wrong in a child suffering in that way. That shouldn't happen. So, innocent suffering is a problem for everyone, not just Christians. But there is an answer. It's just a
Need to wait.
multi-part answer. Yeah. So Job's unparalleled goodness highlights just how awful innocent suffering is. And it raises the question, is God just? Or is God fair? Okay, so that's that point about innocence. That has to be made or Job won't make any sense. Okay, Roman numeral 3, questioning God. Is it permissible to question God? Give me a yes or no vote with your thumb. Yes. You got 2 yeses. You think so?
Well, not question what you can wonder why. I don't mean question because we know he's all powerful and he has a plan
So,
for everything.
Okay, so
according to your question, when you question God, that can be generalized.
right. I see what you're saying. Yes, you're right. So the next question then, is it good to question God? Well, again, it depends on your question, but Job teaches us this. It's better to be honest. It's better to be honest than to hide your question from God, because he knows what you're thinking anyways. However, there are limits to how far it's good to go.
So is it permissible to question God?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
And is it good to question God? Well, it's better to be honest than dishonest with God, but there are limits. Job was praised at the end of the book, but Job's wife was not praised at the end of the book. You see, she crossed a limit in what was appropriate in light of her suffering, and her suffering must have been almost as great as Job's. Okay, so is it wrong to despair, to lose hope, to feel like everything is futile, to wish you were never born? Are those things wrong?
That's wrong.
Yeah.
But just wish you were never born. That's a curse you put upon yourself.
Wait a minute.
Okay, however, God does not blame us. And think about Job 42:7. And the Lord said, you have spoken the truth about me. You have not, he says to the friends, you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. Job said the right things. However, he went through all kinds of despair and wishing he'd never been born, all kinds of that. And he's never blamed for that. So God does not blame us if in our suffering we frankly vent our despair and confess our loss of hope, our sense of uselessness, and even our lamentation about life itself. My personal recommendation would be to phrase it this way. God, I feel like I wish I'd never been born. That's how I'm feeling right now. I feel like my whole life is one big useless failure. That's how I feel. Because when in doing that, you are acknowledging, it certainly seems this way to me, but perhaps my feelings are clouding my thinking. So you're just acknowledging, this is how I feel. It doesn't necessarily mean it's all true.
But you're not blaming God when you put it that way.
Yeah, Job comes mighty close to blaming God in all of this. We'll see. I mean, depends on what you mean by blame, but he certainly does say God took all this away. So he certainly blames God in the sense that he said God did this. Right? Even though Satan had done it, Job says God did it.
I think that's a natural instinct because we know that he is the creator.
Well, he says if you take the good, you got to take the bad.
Yes, yes.
I remember a situation where I was very hurt, and I questioned why, but I didn't blame God. You see what I'm saying? I wasn't angry at him.
Right.
I questioned, but I wasn't.
Yeah, you're talking about being angry. I think when you say blame, you mean get angry at God.
Yeah.
Although,
I didn't say, why did you do this? Why did you cause that? I knew that wasn't the case.
well, last week, you weren't here last week, but we spent a lot of time explaining that even when Satan does something, or a human being does something evil, God allowed that. So there is a sense in which God is responsible for everything that happens. There's a sense. He's indirectly responsible because he could step in at any moment, and sometimes he chooses not to step in.
Right, because he gave us a free will, and it was
But,
a choice another person made.
well, let me ask you this. Sorry, I don't want to repeat last week, but if someone was running up at you with a knife and you prayed, God, please stop this person, would God say, well, I can't because I gave him free will? I can't step in and stop this murderer. You see, the problem with saying free will means God's not responsible for sins. That's a problem. And God himself acknowledges that even though Satan did these things to Job, that he allowed it. Yeah. He said he described it as him doing it as well.
Does Satan have free reign?
Oh, certainly not. Last week we talked about how Satan had to get permission from God.
Every time, or does he have one permission to rape and plunder the earth?
I mean, he certainly, not with Job, he didn't have, he had to go, for this one individual person, he had to go get permission from God to harm this person, and then to harm his stuff, and then to harm his body, he had to go get separate permission.
Good point.
So it appears that every time Satan wants to do something to an individual,
You got to get permission.
yeah. Now it could be to God's people. Maybe Satan has free reign over people in rebellion against God. Obviously, Job was a believer, so it's not totally clear. But certainly it emphasizes Satan's limits, that Satan is very limited in what he's allowed to do.
And that's what we have to reflect on, the fact that he is limited because we have the power of the Holy Spirit within us.
Yes.
And that is where, even like if somebody's coming at you that wants to hurt you, in your mind, or you could speak it in Jesus' name. Bring Jesus in the presence of it all.
Yeah, and certainly this book teaches us that God is concerned about an individual's suffering. Yeah.
Maybe he may permit things to happen, but also the fact that we have that covering. And it's all in the name of Jesus and in his blood.
Okay, let's move on to Roman numeral 4, knowledge versus experience. Would you consider a Christian friend immature if they honestly said, I wish I'd never been born? If somebody said that to you, they're going through a horrible situation, they say, I honestly wish I had never been born. What was that, Michael?
Probably not the first time, maybe the second time.
Maybe the second time you'd think, okay, this person's kind of immature. Well, is Job immature? Was he naive about innocent suffering his entire life up until this?
Probably, yes.
Yeah, he didn't have a Bible back then to kind of reference.
Yeah, because he'd been blessed his whole life.
Well, 3:25, we talked about this last week. We thought it was very odd that Job said, "What I feared has come upon me." And that shows that Job has already thought about this.
Yeah,
He's already thought this could happen.
right.
However, thinking through the theology of suffering and planning, okay, you can picture Job saying, if that happens to me, if God has blessed me so much, and I'm worshiping God, but if God takes this all away, I'm going to say, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. He's steeling himself in case it happens. Right? Okay? But thinking through that and planning what you're going to do if it happens is very different from it actually happening and actually feeling it. That's why we see Job initially respond perfectly. And then go right into, I wish I'd never been born, chapter 3. It's like jumping through the ice, those polar bear swimmers. Okay? Let's say you're planning to do that. And so for like a couple hours beforehand, you're like, I know it's going to be really cold. I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to scream. I'm going to be brave in front of my polar bear friends. You're steeling yourself. But no matter how much you steel yourself, when you actually feel the cold water, it will take your breath away. Because there's a difference between knowing about it and experiencing it.
So Job was immature as a Christian.
Well, he was as mature as he was able to be. He thought it through. He knew it could happen. He prepared himself as best he could. It's like, I think,
Lack of knowledge?
there may come a time in my life when the doctor says to me, you have cancer. I know that may happen. And I can steel myself to say, that's God's will, God's in control. I'm going to have to accept it, all of that. But when it actually happens, it's going to be very different from my thoughts about it right now. Amen. It doesn't mean I'm immature. How could I possibly be mature enough to know what it's like to have cancer? To know the emotions that will come with that? I can't be mature enough because I haven't had it. Once it happens to me, I might need to do some maturing then.
So he's mature up to what he has learned to that, been taught to that point, what he knows to that point. But he's not fully mature because he doesn't know all the answers.
Right. That's why it doesn't work when I tell my children, you should be thankful you have so much better than other people. There's kids starving in other countries. And even if they're like, yeah, I know that, but I don't see that, I don't experience that, I don't know what it's like to go 3 days with no food, I can't even, how could they possibly? Now maybe I could do some cruel parenting and say, I'm going to teach you to be thankful for your food. You can't eat for 3 days. Then we'll see how thankful you are. If I did that, I might go to prison. I don't know.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah. But my point is, no matter how much you know in your mind, experiencing it is going to be different. That's right. And so, depending on how much you've suffered, you may be like, yeah, I know, suffering, people suffer, God allows it to suffer, and that's sad, but whatever. God can do what he wants. When you actually go through the suffering, then these questions become very real. Okay, we have two more points to get through before we jump into chapter 4, so let's try to hurry. Page 2, Roman numeral 5, mystery. Okay, here's two things I don't understand. Personally, I, Jacob, don't understand what heaven will be like, and personally, I, Jacob, do not understand calculus. Not only do I not understand it, I don't even know what it's the study of. I think I heard that René Descartes invented calculus. I don't know. I don't know what they're doing in a calculus class. probably it's a math type thing. Now, which one of those is mysterious and which one is complex? Pretty easy, right? Michael, which one do you think is mysterious? And which one is complex? Calculus, yes. I imagine it's complex. I have no idea, but I imagine it's complex. Now, think about this. The point is that heaven is mysterious. And even though my brain might not be smart enough to comprehend either of those things, no matter how good of a teacher I had explaining heaven, no matter how good of a teacher I had explaining calculus, I might not be smart enough to get either of them. But that doesn't change the fact that mysterious means hidden. And complex means, very complicated. Where you might, if you were smart enough, you might get it. No matter how smart you are, if something is hidden from you, you cannot understand it. Okay, so the point is that the book of Job deals with the mysterious will of God. It simply means that it is unrevealed. Obviously, we, the reader, know God has his reasons for doing this to Job. We're seeing behind the scenes in the courtroom of heaven. Job's not seeing any of that.
Right.
And that's very important to know. Job is not seeing any of that. We are. And so we get a vantage point into Job's suffering that Job doesn't have. But we have to remember, from Job's point of view, God's doing this, and I cannot understand why. And I'm not supposed to understand why. God would reveal it to me if he wanted me to know. So we know the reader, number one is we know why Job is suffering, right? And why is that? It's a result of,
Conversation with the devil.
yes, God and Satan's conversation. Good. Number two, does Job know? No, Job doesn't know. Does he ever find out? What do you think, Nancy? Does Job ever find out?
I think it's more of an acceptance rather than finding out. He would have to know all the mysteries of the will of God. So I'm going to accept it.
Right. He has to accept it because he doesn't ever find out. At least not in this book. Maybe once he dies he finds out. But he certainly is not told, even when God appears and talks to him. God talks about the mysteries of his running the universe, and he doesn't ever mention it.
But wouldn't he kind of have an idea he'd done the right thing because everything was restored?
Yes.
He might not understand why he went through it, but he would have to have a feeling of good.
Well, yeah. It's complicated, though, because he does change throughout and realize he's overstepped some bounds throughout. But yeah, in the end, he is rewarded and he is praised by God. But we'll get to that in 2 weeks. Okay. Why doesn't God let Job know?
It was like a test.
It was like a test. So, in order to answer this, let's look at God's intent and Satan's intent. What is Satan's thesis for this whole test thing? It's that worshiping God is ultimately based on,
Blessings.
self-interest. Getting stuff.
Self-interest.
Self-interest, which would mean that, of course, his worship is false. That's Satan's thesis. The fact that Satan thinks that tells you some things about Satan and tells you some of his limitations. Okay, so God's intent is to show that a human being can love God and fear God and pursue righteousness without receiving any prompt reward. So this pursuit of God is therefore independent of material comfort. possibly even in defiance of material comfort. So that's what God is showing through this. What would happen if Job were permitted to see this dimension of his suffering? What God's trying to show, what Satan's trying to do, the fact that there's going to be a book of the Bible written about this. What if God had revealed all that to Job during the suffering? Or even before, he said, hey, let me just heads up, me and Satan have this conversation, so he's going to do some bad stuff to you.
Be angry?
What?
Would he be angry?
Would he be angry? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, he could be. He could be angry if he knew that God was letting Satan take everything away from him.
Well, he knows that God allowed everything to be taken from him already in the book, and he's not angry at
Yeah,
God.
he admits that.
Yeah.
He might not be able to hold it strong. I mean, he might not be able to show his real faith.
Say that again.
He might not be able to hold up as strongly, and he might not be able to show his real faith, true faith.
So it would make it more difficult if God said, I have really good reasons for this. Here they are. You're going to be an example to literally millions of...
Defeat God's purpose.
What?
Would defeat God's
It would defeat God's purpose. Yes. So, honestly, being the object of a contest between God and Satan would be an honor.
Yeah.
When I am diagnosed with cancer, I probably will, because everyone in my immediate family has already had
I
cancer.
rebuke that in Jesus' name.
Okay. Good. Thank you. But let's say it happens to me. I'm not going to think, this is probably because God was bragging about how righteous I am. This is probably why that happened. God was bragging to Satan, Jacob Frantz is so righteous. And Satan said, well, what if you give him cancer? He won't be righteous then. I'm not going to think that, because that's not going to be why it is. But imagine if it were the case. What an honor that would be. I was like, wow. So this isn't just, well, that's kind of the way it goes sometimes. You get old, something gets wrong with you. It's like, wow, God has like a very important purpose for this. That makes it easier to bear. So, knowing that would actually be a reward. And the fact that it's a reward would sort of prove that Satan's correct, that he's doing it for the reward. So the point is, sometimes if you know something is a test, it subverts the test. Right?
Right.
Like, sometimes I'll test my kid and I'll say, hey, don't touch this. And then I'll go out of the room, but I'm watching them through the crack and they don't know I'm watching them to see if they're going to obey. If they knew, if they could like see my eye through the door crack, they'd be like, oh, well, this is a test, so.
They're gonna pass the test.
They're going to pass the test because they know there's they know there's going to be immediate reward or punishment. So if Abraham had been told, hey, by the way, I'm going to test you, it's just a test to see if you're willing to sacrifice your son, then of course Abraham's going to go, and now I'll sacrifice my son.
Waiting for it.
Oh, you stopped me. I was going to do it. Knowing it's a test subverts the test. So Job can't know.
I like the fact that we're going deeper. In the past, I've looked at this as a power struggle between Satan and God.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. It's not a power struggle.
Yeah.
It's very clear that God has all the power. And God says, I'll permit you to do this much. And Satan does it. And God says, see Satan? Job passed the test. And he says, well, if you give me a little more permission to harm his body, then he won't. God says, okay, but you can't kill him. God has all the power and allows Satan certain things. He removes certain protections.
I think it's been taught that way in the past. It's a power struggle.
Yeah, which is very important because some people think of this world as a power struggle between God and Satan. But God's going to barely pull out in the end. Not the way it is at all.
There's no contest.
This war has been very defeated.
No, I knew he would win in the end, but.
Well, I know, but
I wasn't thinking this deeply. Okay.
right, because God's sovereignty isn't taught as strongly as it is in the Bible. In our churches, God's sovereignty, nothing, not even the actions of Satan, step out of the bounds of God's sovereignty. God is ultimately in control. That doesn't mean he likes sin or he directly causes sin, but he certainly in his sovereign will allows sins.
We're fortunate we have the Bible because we know it's the end of it, so we're kind of not like Job. Job didn't know the end. But
Right, yes.
we're very
Which is why Job is a very useful book when you're going through something. You get to see, okay, there's reasons for this that I could never understand. God doesn't want me to understand them, but God has his reasons. I just have to trust that. Right? Okay, so that's part of the lesson is you just have to have faith. Okay, number 5. Therefore, God doesn't let Job know the reason. So as far as Job is concerned, he is simply facing inscrutable mystery, which makes it more frustrating. I don't even understand why it's happening. Right? Have you ever been held up in traffic? Have you ever gotten as far over as you could to try to see what the cause was? That's not going to make the traffic go any faster, but sometimes it's nice to know. You see someone there being carried in a stretcher onto an ambulance, you're like, wow, I'm thankful that I'm just stuck in traffic and I'm not, on life support. So knowing the cause is helpful, but not knowing is very frustrating. Not knowing why and not knowing how long. That's why so many times in the Bible, people are saying, how long, O Lord? Okay, and lastly, Roman numeral 6, Job's faith. Nancy, could you read this paragraph for us? I'll fill in the blanks as you go.
Okay. The mystery of why it happened shows Job's faith throughout the whole book, even while he's on an emotional roller coaster. It is precisely because he believes in God and because he knows God is
loving and just.
that he has such a hard time understanding this huge injustice.
Okay,
It's a mystery.
just pause right there. You see that? Because he believes in God, because he knows God is loving and just, that's why this is so frustrating. God is loving and just, and yet I certainly don't deserve this suffering. He doesn't claim to be sinless because I don't deserve this, right? Just like the child is not sinless, but they don't deserve what happened to them, that one thing. That's why it's so frustrating for Job. Okay, keep going.
And that is why we must place Job's laments in the right framework. Job wrestles with God. He is indignant with God. He challenges God to come before him and provide some answers. But all his struggles are struggles of a
Believer.
believer. At no point does he abandon faith in God. At no point does he follow his wife's advice and
Curse God.
his constant faith, even in midst of questions and struggles, is why Job can be praised by God himself for
Saying,
saying the right things about God.
at the end of the book, God says that Job said the right things. He said the right things within the right framework. It's always the framework of faith. Okay, here's an overview of the structure. We're going to cover that section, 4 through 7 today. Obviously, we won't get through every chapter in this book. But you see how the cycles work? His 3 friends each say something, and Job responds to each one. It peters out in the 3rd cycle, and the 3rd cycle doesn't fully finish. Then Job has some monologues, Elihu has some speeches, and then Job has not a dialogue with his friends, but a dialogue with God. Okay. So, let's go to page 4. The speeches. First, I'd like to give you a summary of all the speeches in all 3 cycles. Donna, could you read the first box?
Yes. Friends offer glib answers and condemning spirit. The heart of their beliefs about God is how he's working, are summed up by, how do you say that?
Eliphaz's
question in 4, 7, and 8. Consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it.
So that's basically a summary of all the friends, what they're saying. Those who sow trouble reap it. So Job, you're reaping it, so guess what? Guess what that obviously means? You've sown it. Okay. Now, what is the significance of, what does it mean to say that they offer glib answers? It's obviously it's not good to offer glib answers.
Kind of like off the cuff.
Off the cuff? What else can we say about that?
They didn't have good answers.
They didn't have good answers. Yeah, they're not good.
Shooting from the hip.
They're shallow. And the whole reason for studying this book is so you can have better, deeper answers, not shallow answers. If you just know the answer without walking the path to arrive at the answer, your answer will be glib or cheap or cliche. The difference between knowing that the Appalachian Trail is 2,175 miles, I know that, but someone who walks it, they know the same fact but a lot deeper.
Yeah, they really know it.
They really know it.
Yeah.
And they know what it means. 2,000 miles is just a number to me. You walk 2,000 miles, it becomes,
I always wanted to, but I never
yeah.
did.
I made it about a week.
You did it about a week.
Yeah, I made it about, 75 miles and then out.
I give you credit for it. I'd love to.
But that's all the time I had. I knew I wouldn't do the whole thing. Anyway, okay, so it's very important that we get better answers than Job's friends, because people were going to ask us stuff like this. Why would God let this happen?
That's a very good answer right there, guys, demonstrating his servant's spiritual integrity.
Okay, you're reading ahead, I see. Yes, it is. No, it's a good answer. Go ahead, Penny. Can you read the second box? This is a summary of the whole discussion.
He is guilty of nothing that can justify such suffering. The readers know this to be true. Job is suffering because God is demonstrating his servant's spiritual integrity to Satan, not because Job is being punished.
Right. So Job keeps offering self-justification and hard questions. And his friends keep coming back to basically the same answer in different ways. Now, when I was a kid, I thought summarization was the end-all of understanding something. I thought, boy, if I could really study one book of the Bible, say Job, and sum it up in one paragraph like is done here, then I would really understand that book. And I'd like to do that to all 66 books and then take that and summarize all that into one paragraph. And then I know the whole Bible. I really thought this. It doesn't work that way. Because the summary is meaningless unless it's unpacked to its fullest form. So that summary, we have to unpack that by going through some of the speeches. So, to feel the weight of their arguments, we need to follow the line of some of their speeches. So, Nancy, could you read Eliphaz's first little speech there in the box?
Then Eliphaz the Temanite replied, "Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It strikes you, and you are dismayed."
Can anyone summarize what he said there? Job, you've instructed other people when they were stumbling. Now it comes to you, and you're discouraged. Well, maybe you need to practice what you preach. Okay. Then Eliphaz takes a sly swipe at Job's distress. He accuses Job of more than mere inconsistency, as the next verse shows. Penny, could you read verse 6?
Should not your piety be your confidence, and your blameless ways your hope?
Now, that doesn't sound on the surface like it's an accusation. By itself, the question could be taken as a form of encouragement. Hey, Job, you're pious, you're a good guy. Let that be your hope. That God will, reward you in the end. But the next verse shows that it's actually all a trap. Penny, can you also read verse 7?
Consider now, who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? Those who sow trouble.
Those who sow trouble reap it, as we already quoted this verse. So, question 6 actually turns out to be a sarcasm. Do you see that? Yeah. Verse 6, shouldn't your piety be your confidence and your blameless ways be your hope? Job, if you're such a righteous guy, then surely God will reward you. But we know that when you sow trouble, you reap it. Okay, so let's turn the page. Let's keep going along. Getting the feel of this first speech by one of the friends. Go ahead, Donna. Can you read the box at the top of page 5?
Amid disquieting dreams in the night, a spirit glided past my face, and the hair on my body stood on end. It stopped, but I could not tell what it was. A form before my eyes, and I heard a hushed voice. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can even a strong man be more pure than his maker?
So he just got done saying, if you sow trouble, you reap it. That's logic. But then reason alone is not enough for Eliphaz. He claims to have learned the truths he enunciates in a vision of the night. What did the vision ask?
Can a mortal be more righteous than God?
Yes. In itself, the question makes an important point. We need to be humble when we approach God on these difficult questions. But Eliphaz applies this vision he had more strongly. Nancy, can you read the next box?
"But if I were you, I would appeal to God. I would lay my cause before him. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. The lowly he sets on high, and those who mourn are lifted to safety."
So here's a summary of that. Job, buddy, stop acting like you're righteous. Be lowly and mourn, meaning mourn for your guilt. And recognize that God is the one who's able to restore his people.
It's almost like he's saying he's being hypocritical.
Yeah. You're being hypocritical because you won't admit that you've sinned and that this is your punishment for it. Okay. Let's see. Donna, could you read the next box? 12 through 14?
12, 14.
Yeah.
He thwarts the plan of the crafty so that their hands achieve no success. He catches schemes of the wily are swept away. Darkness comes upon them in the daytime. At noon they grope as in the night.
So to summarize this, fools and reprobates are destroyed by God. He is so holy, with no W involved, he's so holy that he devours them while they scramble around in futility. Eliphaz is saying, this is just what happens, Job, but... Nancy, 17 to 19?
I think crafty is treated very negatively here. Because I'm crafty, but I'm not.
Are you crafty in the sense of doing crafts?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it's a different kind of crafty.
Yes. Blessed is the one whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal. From 6 calamities he will rescue you. In 7 no harm will touch you.
Okay, so Eliphaz is just driving home. This is God's correction. This is God's discipline. Verse 17. So essentially, he's saying, Job, shut your mouth, just confess your sin, admit that this is God's punishment, and plead for his deliverance. In other words, if you'll confess your sin and plead for God's goodness, you'll find yourself restored to your former comforts. So the nice little formula that Eliphaz presents is confess plus beg equals restored comforts. That's the way it works. You sow trouble, you reap trouble. You confess your sins and beg for God's mercy, and your comforts will be restored. Eliphaz is not saying that he is righteous, perfectly sinless, but he's saying, I've sinned too, but you know what? I confessed it. I asked God to forgive me. I asked God to bless me, and he did. That's the way the world works. Tit for tat. You can just add up someone's righteousness score, and that's the degree to which they'll be blessed. Okay, now Job's response. Last page. Job will not be put off so easily. Okay, I'm going to put now, in this page, I'm going to put the verses after the summary. I'm going to give the summary first. So number 1, Job resents his friends' lack of compassion and their condescension. Penny, could you read the green box there?
Anyone who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. But my brothers are as undependable as intermittent streams, as the streams that overflow.
Okay. So he resents their lack of compassion. They're not being good friends. All right, number 2. Job can see through his friends' unexpressed fears. If the universe is not as ordered as they like to think it is, then they themselves cannot count on security. They need to believe that this is the way the universe works. You sin, you're punished, you confess, and you're righteous, and you'll be blessed. That's it. That's how it works. They need to believe that because otherwise they're afraid of the insecurity and the mystery of the world. Donna, could you read 621?
Now you too have proved to be of no help. You see something dreadful and are afraid.
Imagine these 4 guys, all vastly wealthy, very blessed, very righteous, doing their sacrifices. Suddenly one of them, disaster strikes. The other friends are like, oh no. Does that mean this can happen to any of us? It must be that Job has sinned. Job must have been false this whole time. They see something dreadful and are afraid. Okay, number 3, Job's plea is emotional and pitiable. Nancy, can you read 6:28 and 9?
Sure. But now be so kind as to look at me. Would I lie to your face by hiding sins? Relent, do not be unjust. Reconsider, for my integrity is at stake.
Do you hear the emotion in that? Now be so kind as to look at me. Relent. He's not admitting to what they're accusing him of, but he is asking for their kindness. Okay, now things come to a head here in number 4. Okay, now the first 2 bullet points under number 4, Job reviews his suffering at the end of his speech. The first 2 bullet points, I just put the references. If you don't agree with my summary, you can look up those later. All Job wants is to die before he is tempted to deny the words of the Holy One. That's my summary of 8, 9, and 10.
Yeah, very good.
That's what he's asking. I just want to die before I'm tempted to, do what my wife says. Okay? Eventually, what?
And he's worried about his integrity.
Yes, because they're... Eventually he turns to God and begs for pity. In 7:7. But he is not willing to concede that his suffering is only fair. That's what his friends are saying. Hey, Job, it's only fair that this happens to you. Like when my kids burn themselves playing around the fire. And I said, well, you know what? You kind of got what you deserved because you were playing with the fire. So it's only fair. But Job's saying it's not. And he won't admit that. And that is found in 7:11. Penny, could you read that?
Therefore, I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul.
He begs God to back off, to let him die. Essentially, he's saying, God, why pick on me? Why pick on any man in this way? I'm only giving you the verse for the why pick on me, but he says, why would you do this to anyone, really? But in 7:19, Donna, could you read that?
Just a second, let me find. Oh, will you never look away from me or let me leave? Oh, I'm sorry, let me start again. Will you never look away from me or let me alone even for an instant?
I was very struck. Now, I've read Job, many times before, but I never noticed this verse. I never understood the flow of what Job was saying. He's saying, you can't just let me alone for a second? God, why are you picking on me? Why would you do this to anyone? 17, he talks about everyone. But he gets down to himself in 7:19. Okay, so this is very important. Job does not claim to be sinless. That's very important. He simply argues that any conceivable sin he may have committed does not justify being made God's target. Nancy, could you read 7:20?
Sure. If I have sinned, what have I done to you? You who see everything we do. Why have you made me your target? Have I become a burden to you?
So Job is saying, essentially, I know I have sins, but I've done nothing that deserves this kind of relentless punishment. So why are you doing this to me, God? I can't think of anything I've done that could possibly justify this kind of punishment. So that is a summary of Eliphaz's speech and then Job's response. Now, we're not going to go into in-depth for every speech and response, but I wanted to go in-depth on one of them so you can get the flow of it.